Zurich, 1985. A Soviet KGB officer walked into Credit Suisse's Paradeplatz headquarters carrying a briefcase containing microfilm of NATO military communications intercepts. The material had cost the Soviets approximately $75,000 to develop agent payments, technical equipment, operational security. Within 30 minutes, the KGB officer deposited $200,000 into a numbered account, completing a transaction that had no official records, no tax implications, and no traceable connection to either the Soviet Union or the Western intelligence services that had just purchased their own stolen secrets back. The same bank, on the same day, processed similar deposits for CIA officers paying Eastern European sources, MI6 handlers compensating Soviet defectors, and Stasi operatives receiving funds for penetrating West German agencies. Switzerland wasn't just neutral in the Cold War, it was the financial infrastructure that allowed both sides to operate. Between 1950 and 1991, Swiss banks processed an estimated $500 billion in intelligence-related transactions, maintaining accounts for spies, defectors, double agents, and information brokers from both Eastern and Western blocs. The Swiss didn't take sides, they took deposits and commissions. This wasn't banking. This was the invisible marketplace that turned the Cold War into a functioning economy. The role of Swiss banks in Cold War espionage represents one of the least understood but most crucial aspects of intelligence operations during the second half of the 20th century. While popular understanding of the Cold War focuses on military confrontations, ideological battles, and diplomatic crises, the practical infrastructure that enabled espionage required sophisticated financial mechanisms that could move money across ideological divides while maintaining operational security that protected both sources and handlers. Swiss banking secrecy provided this infrastructure. The Swiss banking law of 1934 had criminalized disclosure of client information, creating legal framework where banks couldn't reveal account holders' identities, even to Swiss government authorities without court orders based on criminal investigations. This secrecy attracted intelligence agencies from both East and West because it solved fundamental operational problems that other banking systems couldn't address. For Western intelligence services, Swiss banks provided mechanisms to pay sources in Eastern Bloc countries who couldn't receive payments through normal channels. A CIA officer couldn't write a check from a Virginia bank account to a Polish intelligence officer providing information about Warsaw Pact military dispositions, but that same CIA officer could deposit funds in a numbered Swiss account, provide the account details to the Polish source, and allow the source to access the money through Swiss banking channels that didn't require disclosing the source's identity or the payment's purpose. For Eastern intelligence services, Swiss accounts solved different but equally critical problems. The Soviet Union operated a command economy where foreign currency was strictly controlled and private accumulation of Western currency was illegal, but KGB officers recruiting Western sources needed to pay those sources in hard currency that held value. Swiss banks allowed Soviet intelligence to maintain accounts funded through various means: gold sales, trade relationships, front companies that could be used to compensate Western sources without the transactions appearing in official Soviet financial records. The scale of these operations was substantial. Declassified documents and post-Cold War investigations suggest that major intelligence services maintained dozens or hundreds of accounts in Swiss banks. The CIA's Directorate of Operations had extensive Swiss banking relationships. The KGB's first Chief Directorate used Swiss accounts for operations throughout Western Europe. British MI6, French SDCE, West German BND, East German Stasi, and intelligence services from smaller nations all relied on Swiss financial infrastructure. The amounts involved were significant, but difficult to quantify precisely. Individual payments to sources ranged from thousands to millions of dollars depending on the value of information provided. A low-level source providing routine information might receive $5,000 to $10,000 annually through Swiss accounts. A highly placed source providing critical intelligence could receive hundreds of thousands or even millions over years of cooperation. Defectors who brought valuable intelligence or expertise could receive substantial settlement payments deposited in Swiss accounts. Beyond direct payments to sources, Swiss banks facilitated the broader financial ecosystem of intelligence operations. They processed payments for technical equipment, safe houses, cover businesses, and operational expenses. They handled currency exchanges necessary for operations spanning multiple countries. They provided the anonymous financial infrastructure that allowed intelligence services to conduct operations that their own governmental budget processes couldn't officially fund or acknowledge. The ethical and legal dimensions of Swiss banking's role in Cold War espionage were complex and contested. From one perspective, Swiss banks were simply providing neutral financial services to legitimate clients. They weren't taking sides in the Cold War, but rather maintaining Switzerland's traditional neutrality by serving both Eastern and Western clients equally. The banks argued they had no responsibility to investigate clients' purposes as long as transactions didn't violate Swiss law. From another perspective, Swiss banks were actively facilitating espionage operations, including activities that violated laws in the countries where those operations occurred. When Swiss banks processed payments for Soviet intelligence officers recruiting Western officials to commit treason, they were arguably complicit in serious crimes, even if those crimes occurred outside Switzerland. The bank's claim of neutrality obscured their functional role as essential infrastructure for intelligence operations that both sides conducted. The secrecy that made Swiss banks valuable for intelligence operations also made them attractive for other purposes, including tax evasion, sanctions avoidance, and money laundering. Intelligence accounts existed alongside accounts for corrupt officials, organized crime, and individuals hiding wealth from tax authorities. This mixing of intelligence money with criminal proceeds created situations where banks couldn't easily distinguish between legitimate intelligence operations and criminal activity. The Swiss banks themselves were private institutions motivated by profit. Intelligence services were valuable clients who maintained substantial deposits, conducted frequent transactions that generated fees, and rarely withdrew all their funds. The banks had financial incentives to accommodate intelligence clients and to protect the secrecy that made their services valuable. This profit motive influenced how banks interpreted their obligations and how they balanced competing considerations of legality, neutrality, and commercial interest. The political relationship between the Swiss government and Swiss banks regarding intelligence accounts was carefully managed. Swiss officials understood that major intelligence services used Swiss banks for operational accounts. They tolerated this activity as part of maintaining Switzerland's position as neutral territory, where representatives of opposing powers could meet and conduct business. But they maintained plausible deniability about specific accounts or transactions, allowing banks to handle sensitive matters without direct governmental involvement. The operational security challenges of using Swiss banks for intelligence purposes were substantial. While numbered accounts provided anonymity from routine disclosure, they weren't completely secure from determined investigation. Foreign intelligence services attempted to penetrate Swiss banks to identify their opponents' accounts. Some Swiss bank employees were recruited as sources by various intelligence services, and banks' internal records, while legally protected, could potentially be seized or leaked. These security concerns meant that sophisticated intelligence services used Swiss accounts carefully, implementing additional operational security measures. They might use multiple accounts, front companies as nominal account holders, and complex transaction patterns designed to obscure the true sources and destinations of funds. They employed professional money managers who understood both intelligence requirements and Swiss banking practices, and they compartmentalized information so that individual officers or sources knew only what they needed to conduct specific operations. Neutrality's price. Switzerland's position during the Cold War was shaped by its experiences in World War II and by deliberate policy choices designed to maintain independence from both Western and Eastern blocs. This neutrality wasn't passive abstention from international affairs, but rather active diplomacy and economic policy aimed at making Swiss territory valuable to all sides while threatening to none. The historical foundations of Swiss neutrality dated to 1815, when European powers recognized Switzerland as permanently neutral territory following the Napoleonic Wars. This neutrality had been tested during both world wars when Switzerland maintained non-belligerent status despite being surrounded by warring nations. The policy combined military preparedness to defend Swiss territory with diplomatic flexibility that allowed Switzerland to maintain relationships with all parties. During World War II, Switzerland's neutrality had been compromised in practice through economic relationships with Nazi Germany, including accepting looted gold, processing financial transactions for the Nazi regime, and allowing limited German use of Swiss transportation infrastructure. These activities were rationalized as necessary concessions to avoid German invasion, but they created moral stain that Swiss authorities were determined to avoid repeating during the Cold War. The Swiss banking sector emerged from World War II with enhanced reputation for secrecy and security, despite controversies about wartime activities. The banking law of 1934 had established criminal penalties for violating client confidentiality, creating legal framework stronger than in other financial centers. This secrecy attracted clients seeking to protect wealth from various threats including taxation, political instability, and governmental expropriation. As the Cold War developed in the late 1940s, Swiss authorities made calculated decisions about how to position Switzerland between the emerging Eastern and Western blocs. They recognized that rigid alignment with either side would compromise Swiss independence and could make Switzerland a target. Instead, they pursued armed neutrality, maintaining strong military capable of making invasion costly while developing economic and diplomatic relationships with both blocs. The banking sector was central to this strategy. Swiss banks' ability to serve clients from both East and West made Switzerland valuable to all parties. A Soviet official who needed to conduct financial transactions in Western currency could use Swiss banks. An American corporation wanting to do business with Eastern European countries despite political tensions could use Swiss intermediaries. This dual accessibility made Switzerland indispensable to both sides. The Swiss franc's stability and convertibility enhanced Switzerland's financial attractiveness. Unlike most currencies during the Bretton Woods period, the Swiss franc maintained strong value and could be freely exchanged for other currencies. This made Swiss accounts attractive for international transactions and for storing value across political boundaries. Intelligence services operating globally needed access to stable convertible currency, and Swiss banks provided it. The physical security of Switzerland and Swiss banks was another crucial factor. Switzerland was geographically positioned in Central Europe, but was neither NATO member nor Warsaw Pact member. Its mountainous terrain and defensive fortifications made military invasion difficult. Its political stability and strong rule of law protected against internal upheaval. These characteristics made Switzerland a secure location for sensitive financial assets when many other locations were politically or militarily vulnerable. The legal framework protecting Swiss banking secrecy was exceptionally strong compared to other jurisdictions. The 1934 banking law made unauthorized disclosure of client information a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment and fines. This wasn't merely regulatory violation but actual crime. Bank employees, directors, and even auditors who revealed client information could face prosecution. This legal framework provided credible assurance that account information wouldn't be disclosed. The numbered account system provided additional operational security beyond basic banking secrecy. In standard Swiss accounts, the client's name appeared on account documentation. In numbered accounts, the client's identity was known only to a small number of senior bank officers, and the account was identified by number for most banking operations. This limited the number of people who could potentially reveal the account holder's identity and reduced the documentation that connected names to accounts. Intelligence services from both blocs recognized the value of this infrastructure for their operations. The CIA's Directorate of Operations established relationships with major Swiss banks in the early 1950s. The KGB's first chief directorate similarly developed Swiss banking connections. Both services used Swiss accounts to pay sources, fund operations, and manage the financial logistics of espionage that spanned continents and political systems. The Swiss government's official position was that it didn't monitor or control how clients used Swiss banks as long as activities didn't violate Swiss law. Intelligence operations conducted in other countries weren't Swiss legal violations even if they violated laws in those countries. A KGB officer maintaining a Swiss account to pay Western sources wasn't committing any crime in Switzerland, even though recruiting those sources to commit espionage was criminal in their home countries. This policy of legal neutrality extended to moral neutrality. Swiss authorities didn't make judgments about whether Eastern or Western intelligence operations were more legitimate or morally justified. From the Swiss perspective, both sides were engaged in similar activities, and Switzerland's role was providing neutral ground and neutral services that both could access equally. This equivalence was crucial to maintaining Switzerland's position between the blocs. The practical implementation of this neutrality required careful diplomatic management. Swiss officials maintained relationships with intelligence services from both East and West, allowing informal communication about operational boundaries and mutual interests. These relationships weren't officially acknowledged but were understood to exist. Intelligence officers from opposing services could both operate in Switzerland as long as they respected Swiss sovereignty and didn't conduct operations targeting Switzerland itself. The economic benefits of this arrangement for Switzerland were substantial. Intelligence services maintained significant deposits in Swiss banks, generating interest and fees. The infrastructure serving intelligence clients also served other international clients seeking Swiss banking services. And Switzerland's reputation as neutral financial center attracted legitimate international business that might have gone elsewhere if Switzerland had aligned with one bloc. The risks were also significant. If Switzerland became too closely associated with one side's intelligence operations, it could become target for the other side. If Swiss neutrality was perceived as facade covering favoritism toward East or West, the entire arrangement could collapse, and if Swiss banking secrecy was compromised through penetration by foreign intelligence services, the system's value would be undermined. Managing these risks required both Swiss government oversight and bank-level security measures. Swiss intelligence services monitored foreign intelligence activities in Switzerland to ensure they remained within acceptable boundaries. Banks implemented security protocols to protect client information from unauthorized access, and informal diplomatic channels allowed Swiss authorities to communicate concerns when foreign intelligence activities threatened to cross lines. The pricing of Swiss banking services to intelligence clients reflected the value and risk involved. Banks charged premium fees for numbered accounts and for services requiring additional discretion. Intelligence services accepted these costs because alternatives were less secure or less accessible. The price of Swiss neutrality, from the intelligence perspective, was the fees and the operational constraints of working within Swiss territory and Swiss legal frameworks. Intelligence currency. The practical mechanics of how intelligence services used Swiss banks to fund operations and compensate sources involved sophisticated financial arrangements that balance operational security, legal compliance, and practical functionality. Understanding these mechanisms requires examining both the technical processes and the operational tradecraft that made the system work. The basic transaction flow for compensating a human intelligence source began with the handler service depositing funds into a Swiss account. For Western services, this typically involved transferring money from operational accounts held in home countries or through allied banking systems. The CIA might transfer funds from accounts in the United States or from accounts held in third countries where the CIA maintained financial infrastructure for regional operations. For Eastern services, the funding sources were more complex. The Soviet Union's command economy meant that official governmental budgets couldn't include line items for espionage operations abroad. Instead, the KGB and other Soviet intelligence services obtained hard currency through various mechanisms including gold sales, earnings from trade operations, and transfers from front companies that conducted legitimate business internationally. The KGB maintained sophisticated financial infrastructure for operations including companies registered in Western countries that appeared to conduct legitimate business but actually served as vehicles for intelligence funding. These companies might export Soviet goods, provide consulting services, or conduct other commercial activities that generated Western currency income. The profits could be deposited in Swiss or other Western banks and then used for intelligence operations without the transactions appearing in official Soviet records. Once funds were deposited in Swiss accounts, the next step was providing access to the source. For sources who could travel to Switzerland, direct access was straightforward. The source could visit the bank, provide account credentials, and withdraw funds in cash or arrange transfers. Many intelligence sources were officials who traveled internationally for legitimate purposes and could include Swiss visits in their itineraries without raising suspicion. For sources who couldn't easily travel to Switzerland, alternative arrangements were necessary. Swiss banks could arrange transfers to accounts in other countries where the source could access funds more easily. They could issue bank cards that allowed withdrawals from affiliated banks in other locations. Or they could provide cashier's checks or other financial instruments that the source could cash elsewhere. The security protocols surrounding these accounts were elaborate. Account opening required careful vetting to ensure the person opening the account was actually the authorized representative of the intelligence service. Banks typically required personal meetings with senior officers who could verify identity and authority. Once accounts were established, access required multiple forms of authentication including passwords, signature verification, and sometimes physical tokens. The numbered account system added additional security layers. When an intelligence officer opened a numbered account for a source, the account was identified by number rather than name for most banking operations. The source's actual identity was recorded in special records accessible only to designated senior bank officers. This compartmentalization meant that most bank employees processing transactions had no knowledge of who actually controlled the accounts. The amounts maintained in intelligence accounts varied widely. Some accounts held minimal balances and were used primarily for transactions. Others held substantial deposits representing accumulated payments for long-term sources or funds reserved for major operations. Account balances in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars were common for active operational accounts. Larger amounts might be held in accounts serving as regional repositories for operations spanning multiple countries. The transaction patterns in intelligence accounts reflected operational rhythms. Accounts might show regular small deposits corresponding to routine source payments. Larger irregular deposits might represent payments for particularly valuable intelligence deliveries. Withdrawals might occur when sources accessed their compensation or when funds were transferred to support new operations. These patterns were generally unremarkable from the bank's perspective since many legitimate clients showed similar transaction characteristics. The currency denominations used in intelligence accounts were strategically chosen. US dollars were preferred for many operations because of the dollar's widespread acceptance and stability. Swiss francs were used for operations in Europe and for storing value. Deutsche Marks, British pounds, and other major currencies appeared in accounts serving operations in specific regions. Eastern intelligence services preferred hard Western currencies over Soviet rubles or other Eastern currencies because Western currencies held value and could be used internationally. The fee structures for intelligence accounts were negotiated individually based on account size, transaction volume, and service requirements. Banks charged annual account maintenance fees, transaction fees, currency conversion fees, and sometimes special fees for services requiring additional discretion or security. These fees were typically higher than for standard commercial accounts, reflecting the specialized nature of the service and the risks banks assumed. The documentation requirements for intelligence accounts were minimal compared to standard accounts. While banks needed basic information about account holders for their own records, they didn't require the extensive documentation that would normally be collected for due diligence purposes. Intelligence services opening accounts might provide minimal identifying information and would resist requests for documentation about fund sources or intended uses. The legal basis for this minimal documentation was Switzerland's banking secrecy law, which didn't require banks to investigate the legitimacy of client funds or to report suspicious transactions to authorities. As long as the bank had no direct evidence that funds came from activities illegal in Switzerland, they could accept deposits without extensive inquiry. This legal framework was precisely what made Swiss banks attractive for intelligence operations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The operational security measures extended beyond the accounts themselves to include the physical and communication security of banking interactions. Intelligence officers meeting with bank representatives used tradecraft to ensure they weren't under surveillance. They varied their routes to banks, used counter-surveillance techniques, and sometimes used intermediaries rather than appearing personally. Communications with banks used secure methods including encrypted cables, coded telephone conversations, and face-to-face meetings rather than written correspondence. The Swiss bank's internal security measures protected intelligence accounts from unauthorized access and from penetration by foreign intelligence services. Banks employed physical security including vaults, guard services, and access controls. They implemented personnel security including background checks on employees with access to sensitive accounts and compartmentalization so that employees knew only what they needed for their specific functions. And they used technical security including safes, encryption, and secure communications. Despite these security measures, intelligence accounts weren't completely immune from compromise. Foreign intelligence services attempted to recruit Swiss bank employees as sources who could provide information about opponents' accounts. Some services conducted technical operations to intercept communications between intelligence clients and banks. And occasionally, information about intelligence accounts leaked through various means including defectors who knew account details. Double payment systems. The most sophisticated and morally complex aspect of Swiss banking in Cold War espionage was how the same financial infrastructure simultaneously served opposing intelligence services, sometimes processing payments for the same information through different accounts. This created situations where Swiss banks were literally facilitating both sides of espionage transactions, collecting fees from services that were actively working against each other. The phenomenon of double agents, individuals providing information to both Eastern and Western services, required financial arrangements that could accommodate payments from multiple sources, without either service discovering the agent was also working for their opponents. Swiss numbered accounts provided ideal infrastructure for this because each service could maintain its own account for the agent, neither knowing about the other account's existence. A classic example of this dynamic involved Eastern European officials who held positions giving them access to classified information valuable to both sides. A Polish military officer might provide information about Warsaw Pact capabilities to the CIA, while simultaneously providing information about NATO operations to the KGB. The CIA would pay him through a Swiss account they controlled. The KGB would pay him through a different Swiss account. The officer would maintain both accounts separately, accessing them during travel to Switzerland or through arranged transfers. From the Swiss bank's perspective, these were simply two separate accounts for two separate clients. The bank had no obligation to inform one client that another account existed for the same individual. Banking secrecy specifically prohibited such disclosure. Even if bank employees suspected that an individual maintained multiple accounts funded by different intelligence services, They couldn't legally reveal this information without violating Swiss law. The economics of double agency created incentive structures where providing information to both sides was more lucrative than working exclusively for one service. If a source could receive $50,000 annually from the CIA and $30,000 from the KGB for similar information, they effectively doubled their compensation. Swiss banking infrastructure made this doubling possible by allowing the source to maintain separate secure accounts that neither service could discover. The information brokers who operated during the Cold War took this dynamic to an extreme. These were individuals or small organizations that collected intelligence through various means and sold it to the highest bidder regardless of political affiliation. They might obtain information through technical means, through their own source networks, or through relationships with officials in various countries. They would then offer this information to both Eastern and Western services, sometimes playing them against each other to drive up prices. Swiss accounts were essential for information brokers because they needed to receive payments from services that wouldn't transact with each other directly. The broker might receive payment from the CIA into one Swiss account and payment from the KGB into another account, with neither service knowing the other was also purchasing the same information. The broker would access both accounts, effectively being paid twice for the same intelligence. The most audacious version of this practice involved selling intelligence back to the service that had originally produced it. In some cases, information that was stolen from Western sources would be sold through intermediaries to Western services without the buyers realizing they were repurchasing their own secrets. The transaction chain might involve multiple intermediaries and Swiss accounts, obscuring the information's origins. A concrete example involved technical intelligence about Soviet weapon systems. The KGB would obtain this information through espionage against Western defense contractors or through their own development programs. They would then sell the information through intermediaries to Western services who wanted to understand Soviet capabilities. The payments would flow through Swiss accounts, with each intermediary taking a commission. Western services ended up paying for information about Soviet systems that the Soviets already knew the West possessed. This practice became particularly prevalent with satellite imagery and signals intelligence. Both sides collected enormous amounts of technical intelligence through satellites and listening stations. Much of this intelligence had value to the other side. Enterprising intermediaries would acquire intelligence from sources in one service and sell it to the other side, using Swiss accounts to receive payments and to obscure the transaction chain. The Swiss banks processing these transactions collected fees at every step. When funds were deposited for initial payment to sources, the bank charged transaction fees. When funds were transferred between accounts or to other institutions, additional fees applied. When currencies were exchanged, conversion fees were collected. The banks profited from both sides' payments and from all the intermediary transactions. The moral implications of this system were profound. Swiss banks were facilitating espionage that violated laws in multiple countries. They were enabling double agents who were committing treason against their home countries. They were processing payments for information that might be used to target military or intelligence personnel. And they were doing all of this while claiming moral neutrality based on the argument that they were simply providing banking services. The legal justification Swiss banks offered was that they weren't responsible for how clients used their accounts. A bank accepting a deposit didn't need to investigate whether the funds came from espionage or whether the client intended to use the funds for illegal purposes. As long as the deposit itself didn't violate Swiss law, the bank could accept it. This legal framework deliberately insulated banks from responsibility for client activities. The practical reality was that banks often had strong suspicions or actual knowledge about the nature of accounts. When a client identified only by number made regular deposits in hard currency and occasional withdrawals timed to coincide with international travel, bank officers could reasonably infer the account's intelligence-related purpose. But Swiss banking secrecy culture discouraged asking questions or documenting suspicions that might create legal liability. The incentive structures for banks meant that intelligence accounts were highly valued despite potential risks. These accounts typically maintained substantial balances, generated frequent transactions that produced fee income, and represented long-term relationships that could last decades. Banks competed for intelligence business, offering premium services and enhanced security to attract and retain these clients. The competition among Swiss banks for intelligence clients led to innovations in account structures and services. Banks developed special protocols for handling sensitive accounts, trained personnel specifically for serving intelligence clients, and established secure communication channels. They offered services including emergency access procedures if a handler needed to urgently contact a source, dead drop arrangements where documents could be securely delivered, and complex transaction structures that obscured fund flows. The geographic distribution of intelligence accounts among Swiss banks reflected both operational security considerations and bank specializations. Major international banks like Credit Suisse and UBS handled accounts for major intelligence services from both East and West. Smaller private banks served more specialized clients or provided additional security through obscurity. And some banks developed particular expertise in serving either Eastern or Western clients, though they maintained the appearance of neutrality. Banking mechanic. So the technical operations of Swiss banks processing intelligence transactions involved specialized procedures, dedicated personnel, and institutional arrangements that went far beyond standard commercial banking. Understanding these mechanics reveals how banks balanced legitimate business practices with the unique requirements of intelligence clients, while maintaining the secrecy that made their services valuable. The account opening process for intelligence clients involved careful authentication procedures. Unlike standard accounts where documentary evidence of identity was required, intelligence accounts often involved minimal documentation. The client might provide only a name, which could be an alias, and a password or code phrase. The bank would verify that the person opening the account had authority from the sponsoring intelligence service through pre-arranged protocols. These authentication protocols typically involved multiple factors. The client would provide specific identifying information that had been communicated through secure channels from the service's headquarters to the bank. They might present physical tokens, special currency notes with serial numbers that had been registered, documents with specific markings, or objects that served as authentication credentials, and they would demonstrate knowledge of operational details that only authorized personnel would possess. The account opening meeting would occur in private bank offices rather than public banking areas. Senior bank officers handled these meetings personally, rather than delegating to standard account managers. The officers conducting the meetings understood that they might never learn the client's actual identity or the account's real purpose. Their role was processing the business transaction according to established protocols while maintaining discretion about the unusual circumstances. The paperwork for intelligence accounts was minimal and carefully controlled. Internal account records would note the numbered account designation and the authentication credentials required for account access. The actual identity of the beneficial owner might be recorded separately in highly restricted files accessible only to the bank's most senior officers. Most account documentation would identify the account only by number, without names or other identifying information. The numbered account system's operational mechanics involved careful compartmentalization of information within the bank. When transactions occurred on numbered accounts, the staff processing the transactions saw only account numbers and transaction details. They didn't know who owned the accounts or why transactions were occurring. This compartmentalization protected account holder identity and reduced the number of bank personnel who could potentially reveal sensitive information. The transaction processing for intelligence accounts followed the same technical procedures as standard accounts, but with additional security protocols. When funds were deposited, they were credited to the numbered account and became part of the bank's pooled assets. When withdrawals occurred, the bank verified that the person requesting withdrawal had proper authentication credentials, and when transfers were arranged, the bank ensured the receiving account or institution was properly specified. The cash handling procedures for intelligence accounts were particularly important because many transactions involved physical currency rather than electronic transfers. Intelligence sources often preferred cash because it was untraceable and could be used immediately without leaving electronic records. Banks maintained substantial currency reserves and could provide large cash withdrawals when requested by authorized account holders. The currency conversion services were essential for intelligence operations spanning multiple countries. An account might receive deposits in US dollars but need to provide withdrawals in Swiss francs or Deutsche Marks. Banks would execute these conversions, charging fees based on transaction size and current exchange rates. The conversion services allowed intelligence accounts to function across different currency zones without requiring separate accounts in each currency. The secure communications infrastructure connecting intelligence clients with banks evolved significantly over the Cold War period. Early operations relied heavily on in-person meetings and physical documents. As technology advanced, encrypted telex communications became common. By the 1980s, some banks offered early encrypted digital communications for their most sophisticated clients. Though many intelligence services remained cautious about electronic communications security, the physical security of bank facilities processing intelligence accounts was enhanced beyond standard commercial banking requirements. Vaults storing documentation for numbered accounts had additional access restrictions. Office areas where intelligence account officers worked had controlled entry. and the facilities were designed to prevent unauthorized surveillance through technical measures including electromagnetic shielding and counter-surveillance equipment. The personnel selection and management for staff handling intelligence accounts was careful and deliberate. Banks selected officers known for discretion and loyalty to the institution. They provided specialized training in operational security and in recognizing potential security threats. And they monitored personnel for indicators of compromise, including lifestyle changes that might suggest they were being paid by foreign services to reveal account information. The compensation for bank officers handling intelligence accounts included premiums reflecting the sensitivity and importance of their work. These officers were among the bank's best-paid personnel below executive level. The compensation both reflected their value to the institution and created incentive for maintaining confidentiality. An officer earning substantial salary and bonuses had financial reasons to protect the business rather than risk dismissal by violating secrecy. The institutional culture within Swiss banks regarding intelligence accounts emphasized non-judgmental service delivery. Officers were trained not to make moral judgments about clients or their activities. The professional standard was providing banking services efficiently and securely while maintaining absolute confidentiality. Questions about whether client activities were legal in other jurisdictions or whether they were morally acceptable were considered outside the bank's purview. The legal compliance procedures for intelligence accounts focused narrowly on Swiss legal requirements. Banks needed to ensure they weren't facilitating activities illegal in Switzerland, but they had no obligation to enforce other countries' laws. Money laundering, for example, wasn't a crime in Switzerland during most of the Cold War period, so banks didn't need to investigate whether funds came from illegal activities as long as those activities didn't violate Swiss law. The regulatory oversight of Swiss banks during the Cold War was limited compared to contemporary standards. Swiss banking regulators focused primarily on financial solvency and on protecting the banking system's stability rather than on monitoring individual accounts or transactions. This light regulatory touch reflected deliberate Swiss policy choices that prioritized banking secrecy and international competitiveness over aggressive supervision. The audit procedures for intelligence accounts were adapted to maintain secrecy while ensuring basic financial controls. External auditors reviewing bank operations might examine numbered accounts' financial records without learning account holder identities. Internal audits verified that proper procedures were followed for authentication and transaction authorization, but the audits didn't investigate underlying purposes or beneficial ownership beyond what was necessary for financial reporting. The technology infrastructure supporting intelligence accounts was state-of-the-art for its time, but was also designed with security as paramount concern. Computer systems storing account data had access controls that limited which personnel could view sensitive information. Backup systems ensured continuity if primary systems failed, and the systems were isolated from external networks to prevent remote access or hacking. The business continuity planning for intelligence accounts addressed scenarios where normal operations might be disrupted. Banks maintained procedures for emergency account access if a handler needed to urgently contact a source or provide funds. They had protocols for continuing operations if personnel were unavailable, and they planned for scenarios including natural disasters, political upheaval, or military conflict that might threaten banking operations. Eastern accounts, the Soviet Union, and other Eastern Bloc intelligence services' use of Swiss banking infrastructure required overcoming significant structural challenges inherent in command economy, where private accumulation of hard currency was illegal and where international financial transactions were strictly controlled by state authorities. Understanding how Eastern services solved these challenges reveals both the sophistication of Soviet intelligence operations and the flexibility of Swiss banks in accommodating clients operating under constraints that Western services didn't face. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, required substantial hard currency to fund operations in Western countries. They needed to pay Western sources who demanded payment in convertible currencies that held value. They needed to fund cover operations including businesses and organizations that appeared legitimate but served intelligence purposes. And they needed to manage financial logistics for operations spanning multiple countries with different currencies and banking systems. The official Soviet budget process couldn't accommodate these requirements. The state budget was denominated in rubles and allocated through central planning processes. Line items for espionage operations in Western countries couldn't appear in official budgets that might be examined by auditors or planners who lacked appropriate clearances, and the amounts needed for intelligence operations would have been difficult to justify within the official budget framework. The solution involved establishing parallel financial systems that generated hard currency outside official governmental channels. The KGB and other intelligence services operated commercial enterprises that conducted legitimate business internationally and generated hard currency income. These enterprises included trading companies that exported Soviet goods, consulting firms that provided services to Western clients, and other businesses that created plausible cover for intelligence personnel while producing revenue. These commercial operations were often quite sophisticated. The KGB operated trading companies that exported Soviet commodities including timber, metals, and manufactured goods. They established consulting firms that provided technical expertise in areas where Soviet capabilities were respected. They created publishing companies, travel agencies, and other service businesses that could operate internationally while serving intelligence purposes. The revenue from these commercial operations flowed into accounts in Western banks, including Swiss institutions. From these accounts, funds could be distributed for intelligence operations without the transactions appearing in official Soviet records. A KGB trading company might deposit earnings from timber exports into a Swiss account. From that account, funds could be transferred to operational accounts used to pay Western sources or fund intelligence operations. The use of front companies extended beyond revenue generation to include creating corporate identities for operational accounts. Rather than opening accounts directly in the KGB's name, which would have been problematic for multiple reasons, the KGB opened accounts in names of various companies, organizations, and sometimes individuals. These nominal account holders provided cover that made the accounts appear legitimate while obscuring their actual intelligence purpose. The Soviet approach to Swiss banking involved maintaining larger account balances than Western services typically held because of the difficulty of rapidly moving funds from the Soviet Union, Switzerland. Western services could arrange transfers from home country accounts relatively easily. Soviet intelligence had to accumulate hard currency over time through their commercial operations and then maintain sufficient balances in Swiss accounts to fund ongoing operations without requiring frequent deposits. The KGB's account management reflected operational patterns distinct from Western services. Soviet intelligence operations often involved longer-term cultivation of sources and more patient operational approaches than the more transactional relationships common in Western intelligence. This meant that payments to sources might be structured as regular small amounts over years rather than large payments for specific information deliveries. The Swiss account transactions reflected these different operational philosophies. The recruitment of sources by Soviet intelligence often involved ideological motivation as well as financial compensation. Unlike Western services that primarily relied on financial incentives, Soviet intelligence recruited some sources who were motivated by communist ideology or by opposition to Western policies. However, even ideologically motivated sources typically received financial compensation deposited in Swiss accounts, both as recognition of their value and to provide financial security. The amounts paid to Western sources by Soviet intelligence varied based on the source's position and the value of information provided. A low-level source might receive $10,000 to $20,000 annually. A highly placed source providing critical intelligence might receive $50,000 to $100,000 or more. Defectors or recruited officials who required relocation expenses and resettlement support might receive substantial lump sums deposited in Swiss accounts they could access after defecting. The East German Stasi, operating as close ally of the KGB, developed particularly sophisticated Swiss banking relationships because of East Germany's geographic position and economic structure. East Germany conducted substantial trade with West Germany and other Western countries, generating hard currency that could be used for intelligence operations. The Stasi maintained accounts in Swiss banks that served both their own intelligence operations and supported KGB operations in Western Europe. The Stasi's account management was notable for its professionalism and careful documentation. Unlike some Eastern services that operated with minimal records to maintain security, the Stasi maintained detailed internal records of accounts, transactions, and source payments. These records were strictly compartmented and secured, but their existence meant that when the Stasi archives were opened after German reunification, substantial information about Swiss account usage became available. The Polish, Czechoslovak, Hungarian, and other Eastern European intelligence services also maintained Swiss accounts, though generally at smaller scale than Soviet or East German operations. These services faced similar challenges of generating hard currency and managing financial logistics for operations in the West. They sometimes cooperated with Soviet intelligence in sharing account infrastructure or in coordinating financial arrangements for joint operations. The Chinese intelligence services developed Swiss banking relationships somewhat later than Soviet services, but eventually maintained significant operations. Chinese intelligence faced particular challenges because China's economy was even more closed than the Soviet Union's during much of the Cold War period. Chinese services used similar approaches, including commercial operations that generated hard currency and front companies that nominalized accounts. The operational security measures Eastern services employed for Swiss accounts were extensive. Account information was strictly compartmented, with knowledge limited to officers directly involved in specific operations. Communications with banks used encrypted channels and coded language, and physical access to banks involved counter-surveillance and other tradecraft to prevent Western services from identifying Eastern intelligence officers or learning about their banking activities. The vulnerability of Eastern services' Swiss accounts to Western intelligence penetration was significant concern. Western services attempted to recruit Swiss bank employees who might provide information about Eastern accounts. They conducted surveillance of Swiss banks to identify Eastern intelligence officers visiting for account business, and they used signals intelligence and other technical methods to intercept communications about accounts. Despite these Western efforts, Eastern services' Swiss accounts generally remained secure throughout the Cold War. The combination of Swiss banking secrecy law, banks' internal security measures, and Eastern services' operational security proved effective at protecting account information from unauthorized disclosure. Compromises occurred occasionally through defectors who revealed account details or through recruited bank employees, but systematic penetration of Eastern account infrastructure didn't occur. The political dynamics within Eastern Bloc countries regarding intelligence services' hard currency accounts created tensions. Intelligence services controlled substantial Western currency outside normal governmental oversight. This financial autonomy gave intelligence services significant power and independence that other governmental agencies lacked. It also created temptations for corruption, as individual officers might divert intelligence funds for personal use. Western operations. Western intelligence services' use of Swiss banking infrastructure involved different operational patterns and challenges compared to Eastern services, reflecting the structural differences between market economies and command economies. Understanding these Western operations provides insight into how democratic societies' intelligence services conducted financial aspects of espionage, while operating under different legal and political constraints than their Eastern counterparts. The Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Operations maintained extensive Swiss banking relationships throughout the Cold War. The CIA's approach to Swiss accounts reflected American institutional culture, emphasizing professionalism, accountability, and careful management, even within the secrecy required for intelligence operations. CIA officers operating Swiss accounts followed detailed procedures designed to prevent unauthorized use while maintaining the operational security necessary for protecting sources. The CIA's Swiss account structure was sophisticated and compartmented. Rather than maintaining single accounts for broad operations, the CIA established multiple accounts serving different geographic regions, operational categories, or specific cases. This compartmentation meant that compromise of one account wouldn't expose the entire account infrastructure. It also facilitated accounting and ensured that funds designated for specific operations were actually used for those purposes. The funding for CIA Swiss accounts came through various mechanisms, including official budget allocations, proprietary companies that generated revenue, and sometimes from allied services or friendly foreign governments. The official CIA budget included allocations for foreign operations, and portions of these allocations could be transferred to Swiss accounts through international banking channels. Proprietary companies, businesses owned or controlled by the CIA, could generate income that supplemented official funding. The amounts the CIA maintained in Swiss accounts reflected operational tempo and geographic coverage. During periods of intensive operations in specific regions, account balances would grow to ensure adequate funds were available. During quieter periods, balances might be drawn down. Overall, CIA Swiss accounts likely held tens of millions of dollars during peak periods, though exact figures remain classified. The CIA's source payment practices using Swiss accounts emphasized reliability and professionalism. Sources received agreed-upon payments on regular schedules unless operational security required irregular payments. The amounts were generally competitive with what other services paid for comparable intelligence, and the CIA worked to ensure that payments were made securely and that sources could access funds without undue risk of exposure. British MI6's approach to Swiss banking reflected British intelligence traditions, including emphasis on personal relationships, operational flexibility, and sometimes cavalier attitudes toward bureaucratic procedures. MI6 officers operating Swiss accounts had more individual discretion than their CIA counterparts, and sometimes maintained accounts that served personal operational approaches rather than fitting into formal institutional structures. The funding for MI6 Swiss accounts came primarily from the British Treasury through the secret vote, the classified portion of the budget allocated for intelligence services. Unlike the CIA, which had diverse funding sources, MI6 relied more heavily on direct governmental allocations. This meant that MI6's Swiss account balances fluctuated with British fiscal conditions and with political willingness to fund intelligence operations. The payments MI6 made to sources through Swiss accounts were often more irregular and more personally negotiated than CIA payments. MI6 handlers would establish individual relationships with sources and might negotiate payments based on specific intelligence deliveries rather than providing regular salaries. This approach reflected MI6's traditional emphasis on the personal relationship between handler and source rather than on standardized procedures. French intelligence services, including SDEC, later DGSE, maintained Swiss accounts that reflected French political culture and intelligence traditions. French operations often involved closer relationships between intelligence services and French business interests, with French companies sometimes providing cover or support for intelligence operations. This meant that French Swiss accounts sometimes mixed intelligence and commercial purposes more than American or British accounts. West German BND's Swiss operations were influenced by Germany's geographic position and by the particular intensity of East-West confrontation in divided Germany. The BND maintained substantial Swiss accounts to support operations against East Germany and other eastern targets. The amounts involved were significant because West Germany had substantial resources and strong political commitment to intelligence operations against the East. Israeli Mossad's use of Swiss banking reflected Israel's particular intelligence requirements, including operations that spanned multiple continents and involved populations in countries hostile to Israel. Mossad maintained Swiss accounts that supported operations in Europe, the Middle East and elsewhere. The accounts facilitated payments to sources in countries where Israeli intelligence couldn't operate openly and where standard banking channels weren't accessible. The operational patterns of Western services' Swiss accounts showed some common characteristics despite institutional differences. Accounts typically received regular deposits to maintain operational balances. Withdrawals occurred both for scheduled source payments and for ad hoc operational expenses. And the accounts facilitated transfers to other locations where operations were conducted, but where maintaining accounts would be operationally insecure. The technology for accessing Swiss accounts evolved over the Cold War period. Early operations relied heavily on in-person visits by handlers or sources. As international telecommunications improved, telephone and telex communications became more common, though always with security precautions. By the 1980s, some Western services were using early encrypted electronic communications for account instructions, though many maintained traditional methods as backup. The coordination among Western intelligence services regarding Swiss accounts reflected broader intelligence cooperation through relationships including the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, linking the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These services sometimes shared information about Swiss account infrastructure, coordinated in recruiting sources who might require financial arrangements, and occasionally transferred funds between their respective accounts to support joint operations. The oversight of Western services' Swiss accounts varied by country and by period. American intelligence faced congressional oversight that required some reporting about financial matters, though specific account details remained classified. British oversight was lighter and less formal during much of the Cold War. Other Western services faced varying levels of political oversight, depending on their domestic political systems. The accountability mechanisms for Western services' Swiss accounts attempted to balance operational security with preventing misuse of funds. Internal audit procedures verified that funds were used for authorized purposes. Senior officers reviewed major transactions, and periodic reviews examined account balances and transaction patterns to identify anomalies that might indicate problems. Despite these oversight and accountability measures, Western services' Swiss accounts sometimes were misused. Individual officers occasionally diverted funds for personal use. Sources were sometimes overpaid because of poor negotiation or because handlers developed inappropriate personal relationships with sources, and funds were sometimes used for operations that weren't properly authorized. These problems were generally discovered eventually through audit procedures or through other officers reporting concerns. The legal framework governing Western services' Swiss operations was complex because activities legal in Switzerland might violate laws in the countries where sources operated. Recruiting an Eastern official to commit espionage violated laws in that official's country, even though paying that official through a Swiss account didn't violate Swiss law. Western intelligence services operated with understanding that they might be violating foreign laws, but that they had authorization from their own governments for these activities. Technology transfer. One of the most profitable and strategically significant aspects of Cold War Swiss banking involved financial arrangements for transferring Western technology to the Soviet Union, and other Eastern countries despite legal restrictions designed to prevent such transfers. This technology trade occurred through complex networks of intermediaries, front companies, and financial arrangements that relied heavily on Swiss banking infrastructure to move money and obscure transaction chains. The strategic context for restricted technology trade was the military and economic competition between East and West. Western countries, coordinated through the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls (COCOM), maintained lists of technologies that couldn't be exported to communist countries because they would enhance Soviet military capabilities. These restrictions covered computers, telecommunications equipment, precision manufacturing tools, and various other technologies. The Soviet Union desperately wanted access to these restricted technologies because their own technological development lagged behind the West in many critical areas. Rather than developing capabilities independently, which would be slow and expensive, Soviet authorities sought to acquire Western technology through intelligence operations, through legal purchases of items that hadn't yet been restricted, and through illegal smuggling networks that violated export controls. The financial infrastructure for this illegal technology transfer relied heavily on Swiss banks, because transactions needed to cross East-West divide, while obscuring the involvement of Soviet entities. A typical transaction chain might involve a Soviet front company ordering technology from a Western manufacturer, using intermediaries to obscure the end user, and processing payments through Swiss accounts that concealed the Soviet connection. The structure of these operations involved multiple layers of companies, each taking commissions and providing additional obscurity. A Soviet trading company might instruct a Swiss intermediary to purchase specific technology. The Swiss intermediary would engage a Western European trading company to approach manufacturers. The manufacturer would sell to the trading company, which would sell to the Swiss intermediary, which would provide the goods to the Soviet entity. Each transaction would be financed through Swiss bank transfers. The payments in these transaction chains were substantial. Advanced Western technology sold to Soviet end users commanded premium prices because the Soviets had limited alternatives. A piece of manufacturing equipment that might sell for $100,000 in normal commercial transactions could cost $300,000 or more when purchased through illegal channels. The markups compensated intermediaries for the risks they were taking and for the specialized knowledge required to evade export controls. Swiss banks processed these payments without investigating whether the transactions violated export controls in other countries. From the Swiss perspective, the transactions involved legitimate commercial entities paying for goods. The fact that the goods would ultimately reach Soviet end users and that this violated American or other countries' export control laws wasn't Swiss banks' concern, as long as the transactions themselves didn't violate Swiss law. The intelligence services from both East and West were deeply involved in the technology transfer business. Soviet intelligence services, including the KGB and GRU military intelligence, operated companies and recruited Western business people to facilitate technology acquisitions. Western intelligence services monitored these activities and occasionally conducted operations to disrupt them or to identify Soviet acquisition priorities by observing what technologies they sought. The most valuable technologies from Soviet perspective included computers and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Soviet computer technology lagged years behind Western capabilities, limiting Soviet military systems' effectiveness and hampering economic development. Acquiring Western computers and manufacturing equipment allowed Soviets to partially close this gap without developing capabilities independently. The financial arrangements for computer acquisitions involved sophisticated schemes to evade export controls. Western manufacturers wouldn't knowingly sell advanced computers to Soviet end users, but they would sell to apparently legitimate Western companies. These companies would claim they needed the equipment for their own operations. After purchase, the equipment would be diverted to the Soviet Union through shipping routes and intermediaries that obscured its destination. The payments for these diverted computers flowed through multiple Swiss accounts. The original manufacturer received payment from the initial purchasing company through normal banking channels. The purchasing company received payment from the next intermediary through Swiss bank transfer. Subsequent transfers through additional intermediaries and accounts created transaction chains difficult to trace. The ultimate Soviet buyer might be separated from the original manufacturer by 5 or 6 transaction layers. The telecommunications technology transfer was similarly structured, but involved additional complications because telecommunications equipment might be used for military communications and therefore was particularly sensitive from Western security perspective. The Soviets sought advanced switching equipment, encryption technology, and satellite communication systems. These items were strictly controlled, making them difficult but also particularly valuable to acquire. The machine tools and precision manufacturing equipment trade was enormous in scale, because Soviet manufacturing capabilities lagged significantly behind the West. The Soviet Union needed Western manufacturing equipment to improve quality and precision in their own production. They purchased legally when possible and illegally when items were restricted. Swiss banks processed payments for both legal and illegal machine tool transfers, with little apparent distinction. The petroleum and chemical industry technology was another major category. The Soviet Union had extensive oil and gas resources, but needed Western technology to develop them efficiently. Western oil services companies would sell equipment and expertise, sometimes directly to Soviet entities, and sometimes through intermediaries. Swiss banks facilitated these transactions, which generated billions of dollars over the Cold War period. The role of West German and Austrian companies in technology transfer to the East was particularly significant because these countries' geographic positions and economic relationships with Eastern Europe created natural trade connections. Companies in these countries developed expertise in navigating the legal and illegal aspects of East-West technology trade. Swiss banks served as primary financial infrastructure for their operations. The enforcement efforts by Western governments to prevent illegal technology transfer faced significant obstacles. Intelligence services could identify some illegal transactions through surveillance and source reporting. Customs authorities could intercept some shipments. But the complexity of transaction chains and the use of Swiss banking secrecy made it difficult to prove illegal diversion had occurred or to prosecute those responsible. The occasional prosecutions that did occur revealed the sophistication of the schemes and the amounts involved. In the 1980s, American authorities prosecuted several cases involving illegal technology transfer to the Soviet Union. The investigations revealed networks of companies spanning multiple countries, transactions involving millions of dollars, and systematic use of Swiss banks to process payments and obscure Soviet involvement. The Soviet acquisition of Western technology through these illegal channels provided significant military and economic benefits. Soviet weapons systems incorporated Western computers and electronics that improved their capabilities. Soviet manufacturing improved through use of Western machine tools, and Soviet petroleum industry benefited from Western technology and expertise. The strategic impact of technology transfer arguably reduced the Western technological advantage that was crucial to the Cold War military balance. Defector economics. The financial arrangements for defectors represented some of the most complex and sensitive aspects of Cold War Swiss banking, because they involved substantial payments, long-term financial security, and exceptional operational security requirements. Understanding how intelligence services used Swiss accounts to facilitate defections and to support defectors provides insight into both the economics of intelligence collection and the human dimensions of Cold War espionage. The decision to defect for Eastern officials involved enormous personal risk and required severing all ties to homeland, family, and previous life. Financial security was a critical factor influencing whether officials considering defection would actually take the step. Intelligence services recruiting defectors needed to demonstrate they could provide not just immediate safety, but long-term financial stability that would allow defectors to build new lives in the West. The financial packages offered to defectors varied enormously based on the defector's position, the value of intelligence they could provide, and the recruiting service's resources and policies. A routine defector might receive $50,000 to $100,000 in settlement payments. A highly valuable defector providing critical intelligence or expertise might receive $500,000 to $1 million or more. The most exceptional cases, senior officials bringing extremely valuable information, could command even larger amounts. Swiss accounts were ideal for defector payments because they provided security and flexibility that other financial arrangements couldn't match. Funds deposited in Swiss-numbered accounts couldn't be traced by Soviet intelligence services attempting to locate defectors or recover money. The accounts could be accessed from multiple locations, allowing defectors to receive funds regardless of where they ultimately settled. And the accounts provided privacy-protecting defector financial information from public disclosure. The structure of defector financial arrangements typically involved multiple components. An initial settlement payment compensated for lost pension rights, property left behind, and immediate needs in establishing a new life. Regular support payments over months or years provided income until the defector found employment or established other income sources. And sometimes additional payments recognized particularly valuable intelligence provided or compensated for ongoing risks the defector faced from Soviet retaliation attempts. The negotiation of defector financial terms sometimes became quite detailed. Sophisticated defectors understood their intelligence had value and negotiated for better terms. Handlers had to balance paying enough to secure cooperation while avoiding excessive payments that might create operational security problems or establish precedents that would make future recruitments more expensive. The most famous defectors often received substantial payments that remained controversial years later. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who provided critical intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities in the early 1960s, received substantial payments before his capture and execution. KGB officer Oleg Gordievsky, who defected in 1985, received financial support that allowed him to build a comfortable life in the West. The amounts involved in these cases were significant, though exact figures remain classified. The verification challenges in defector cases involved confirming that defectors were genuine and that the intelligence they provided was accurate rather than disinformation. Financial arrangements needed to be structured so that payments were contingent on the defector providing valuable and reliable information. Some arrangements involved holding back portions of promised payments until intelligence could be verified, while other arrangements paid up front based on the defector's apparent credibility and position. The false defector problem complicated financial arrangements. Soviet intelligence occasionally sent officers to pose as defectors to penetrate Western services or to identify Western intelligence officers. These false defectors would claim to have valuable information and would request financial support. Western services needed to provide enough financial incentive to attract genuine defectors while avoiding large payments to false defectors who were actually Soviet intelligence officers. The taxation issues for defector payments varied by country and circumstances. In the United States, defector payments might be structured as tax-free under provisions treating them as compensation for extraordinary risks or as payments for services to the government. In other cases, payments might be taxable income requiring defectors to report them to tax authorities. Swiss accounts helped manage these tax questions by providing flexibility about when and where funds were accessed. The family support arrangements for defectors added complexity to financial planning. Defectors leaving behind families in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe often wanted to provide financial support to those families despite the obvious operational security problems this created. Swiss accounts could facilitate such support through intermediaries and mechanisms that obscured the source of funds, though intelligence services generally discouraged family support because of the risks. The relocation expenses for defectors could be substantial. Beyond initial financial settlements, defectors needed housing, transportation, identity documentation, and assistance establishing themselves in new countries. Western intelligence services provided this support as part of defector resettlement programs, with costs often running to hundreds of thousands of dollars when all expenses were tallied. The security protection for defectors sometimes extended to financial security against Soviet attempts to recover funds or to financially harm defectors. Swiss accounts provided protection against account freezing or seizure that might occur if Soviet authorities discovered account details and attempted legal action to recover funds they claimed were stolen from the Soviet state. The long-term financial outcomes for defectors varied widely. Some defectors successfully built new careers and achieved financial independence, eventually no longer needing intelligence service support. Others remained dependent on service support for years or decades, either because they couldn't successfully integrate into Western societies or because their public identification as defectors prevented them from obtaining normal employment. The pension arrangements for defectors attempted to compensate for pension rights lost by defecting. Soviet officials would have been entitled to state pensions after retirement, and defection meant forfeiting these pensions. Western services sometimes structured payments to provide pension-like regular income that defectors could rely on in old age, with Swiss accounts providing the financial infrastructure for these long-term arrangements. The death benefits and inheritance planning for defector accounts raised complicated questions. When defectors died, what happened to funds remaining in their Swiss accounts? If they had families in the West, inheritance was straightforward. But if their closest relatives remained in the East, providing inheritances would expose those relatives to Soviet attention. Intelligence services and banks worked to structure accounts to address these contingencies. Institutional complicity. The role of Swiss banks in facilitating Cold War intelligence operations raises fundamental questions about institutional responsibility, legal obligation, and moral culpability when financial institutions provide services they know or should know, support illegal activities in other jurisdictions. Understanding Swiss banks' level of knowledge and their institutional choices reveals how commercial incentives and legal frameworks can combine to enable systematic wrongdoing. The question of what Swiss banks knew about their intelligence clients is complex because knowledge existed at multiple levels. Individual bank officers handling specific accounts clearly knew they were serving intelligence services. Senior management understood that the bank maintained accounts for foreign intelligence operations, but the knowledge wasn't necessarily systematized or fully documented because banking secrecy culture discouraged recording information that might create legal liability. The evidence from post-Cold War investigations and from employees' later accounts suggests that major Swiss banks were well aware they were processing intelligence payments. Specific accounts were internally designated as sensitive accounts requiring special handling. Particular officers were assigned to work with intelligence clients, and banks developed procedures specifically designed to accommodate intelligence operational security requirements while maintaining plausible deniability about illegal activities occurring in other countries. The legal framework protecting Swiss banks from liability for client activities was deliberately structured to allow banks to profit from questionable transactions while avoiding responsibility for their consequences. Swiss law didn't require banks to investigate the legitimacy of client funds or to refuse deposits based on suspicions that clients might be engaged in activities illegal elsewhere. This legal framework was policy choice reflecting Swiss governmental decisions to prioritize banking secrecy and financial services competitiveness. The commercial incentives for banks to accommodate intelligence clients were substantial. Intelligence accounts generated significant fee income from transactions, currency conversions, and account maintenance. The accounts typically maintained large balances that the bank could use in its ordinary lending and investment operations, and intelligence clients represented long-term relationships that could span decades, providing stable revenue streams. The competition among Swiss banks for intelligence business meant that banks that refused intelligence clients on moral or legal grounds would simply lose business to competitors willing to be less scrupulous. This competitive dynamic created pressure for all banks to accommodate intelligence operations regardless of qualms about the activities being facilitated. Banks that maintained higher standards would be disadvantaged relative to less selective competitors. The institutional culture within Swiss banks emphasized service to clients and protection of client confidentiality as paramount professional values. Bank employees were trained to view client confidentiality as nearly absolute obligation. Questions about whether client activities were legal or moral were discouraged as unprofessional intrusions into matters outside the bank's proper concern. This culture created a psychological environment where employees didn't question serving intelligence clients. The relationship between Swiss banks and the Swiss government regarding intelligence accounts involved mutual understanding that allowed both to benefit while maintaining plausible deniability. The government understood that banks served foreign intelligence services but didn't officially monitor or regulate these relationships. Banks understood that the government tolerated intelligence accounts as part of Switzerland's broader policy of neutrality and as contribution to Swiss financial services industry. The complicity of Swiss banks extended beyond passive acceptance of intelligence accounts to active assistance in structuring arrangements that evaded other countries' laws. Banks advised intelligence clients about how to structure transactions to minimize traceability. They established complex corporate structures that obscured beneficial ownership, and they provided secure communications and operational support that went beyond standard banking services. The moral arguments defending Swiss banks' behavior emphasized the principle that banks shouldn't be responsible for enforcing other countries' laws. If American law prohibited certain intelligence operations, that was America's concern, not Switzerland's. Swiss banks providing services legal in Switzerland weren't morally responsible for how clients used those services, even if the ultimate use violated foreign laws. The counter-arguments emphasized that banks knowingly facilitated serious crimes including treason, espionage, and illegal weapons development. The principle that banks needn't enforce foreign laws didn't absolve them of moral responsibility for deliberately enabling activities they knew were criminal and harmful. A bank that processed payments it knew were compensating foreign officials for betraying their countries was morally complicit in that betrayal, regardless of legal technicalities. The specific examples of harmful intelligence operations enabled by Swiss banking illustrate the moral costs. When Swiss banks processed payments for operations that led to intelligence officers being identified and executed, they were complicit in those deaths. When they facilitated technology transfers that strengthened Soviet military capabilities, they contributed to extending the Cold War and increasing risks of nuclear confrontation. The harms weren't abstract, but involved real people dying and real security threats being enhanced. The information asymmetry between banks and their intelligence clients complicated responsibility assessment. Banks knew they were serving intelligence operations, but typically didn't know specific operational details. An account might be used to pay a source, but the bank wouldn't necessarily know whether that source was providing legitimate intelligence about military capabilities or was betraying sensitive operations that would lead to deaths. This limited knowledge made it easier for banks to claim they weren't responsible for operational consequences. The comparison to other cases of institutional complicity in wrongdoing provides context for evaluating Swiss banks' behavior. Banks during World War II that accepted Nazi gold looted from occupied countries faced similar questions about knowledge and responsibility. Banks that processed funds for organized crime or corrupt dictators similarly claimed they were just providing banking services. In each case, the question was whether commercial motives and legal technicalities excused knowing facilitation of serious wrongdoing. The regulatory reforms proposed after the Cold War to address these issues included requirements for greater transparency about beneficial ownership, obligations to report suspicious transactions, and international cooperation in investigating financial crimes. Switzerland gradually adopted some of these reforms under international pressure, though banking secrecy remained stronger in Switzerland than in most other financial centers. The retrospective judgments about Swiss banks' Cold War role remain contested. Some observers view the banks as having provided valuable neutral infrastructure that both sides could use, reducing the risks of Cold War confrontation by providing channels for intelligence operations that might otherwise have been more dangerous. Others view the banks as having profited cynically from facilitating espionage and from enabling operations that caused deaths and international instability. The institutional memory within Swiss banks about their Cold War intelligence role is generally not publicly acknowledged. Banks don't advertise their historical relationships with intelligence services. Former employees who handled intelligence accounts typically maintain confidentiality even years after retirement. And the bank's official histories generally omit or minimize discussion of intelligence operations, preferring to emphasize more conventional banking activities. Exposure attempts throughout the Cold War. Various efforts were made to expose or disrupt the use of Swiss banks for intelligence operations by journalists, intelligence services themselves, and governmental authorities concerned about the implications of this financial infrastructure. Understanding these exposure attempts and why they largely failed reveals the structural protections that maintained Swiss banking secrecy despite repeated challenges. The journalistic investigations into Swiss banking and intelligence operations faced fundamental obstacles, including Swiss banking secrecy laws, the operational security practices of intelligence services, and the difficulty of obtaining documentary evidence about transactions that were deliberately obscured. Journalists attempting to investigate these matters couldn't access bank records, couldn't compel testimony from bank employees, and couldn't examine intelligence service documentation that remained classified. The Swiss legal framework aggressively protected banking secrecy against journalistic inquiry. Journalists who attempted to investigate accounts could be prosecuted for violating banking secrecy laws if they obtained information through means that involved bank employees revealing confidential information. This created substantial legal risks for investigative journalism and deterred many potential investigations. The few journalistic exposés that were published during the Cold War generally relied on information from defectors, from intelligence officers willing to speak anonymously, or from indirect evidence about patterns of transactions and account holdings. These exposés could describe the general phenomenon of intelligence use of Swiss accounts, but rarely could provide specific details about particular accounts or transactions without risking legal liability. The intelligence services themselves sometimes attempted to expose or disrupt their opponents' Swiss accounts through operations designed to identify accounts, to freeze or seize funds, or to undermine the security of the banking infrastructure. These operations had limited success because Swiss banking secrecy and Swiss governmental protection of banks prevented systematic penetration. The attempts by intelligence services to recruit Swiss bank employees as sources who could provide information about opponents' accounts represented ongoing operational priority for services from both East and West. Successful recruitments occurred occasionally, providing valuable intelligence about specific accounts or about banking procedures that could inform other operations. But the compartmentalization of information within banks and the security consciousness of Swiss banking personnel made systematic penetration difficult. The technical operations against Swiss banks, including signals intelligence collection and surveillance of bank facilities, provided some intelligence but couldn't substitute for direct access to account records. Communications between intelligence clients and banks might reveal some information if intercepted. Surveillance could identify intelligence officers visiting banks, but the actual account records and transaction details remained secure within bank vaults and computer systems that were physically isolated from external access. The governmental efforts to force greater transparency in Swiss banking came primarily from the United States and other Western countries concerned about both intelligence operations and about criminal use of Swiss accounts for money laundering and tax evasion. These governmental pressures increased substantially in the 1980s as American authorities investigated cases involving illegal technology transfer, organized crime, and tax evasion that all involved Swiss accounts. The American pressure on Switzerland regarding banking secrecy included diplomatic démarches, threats of sanctions, and cooperation requests in criminal investigations. American authorities argued that Swiss banking secrecy facilitated serious crimes including violations of export control laws, securities fraud, and organized crime activity. They requested that Switzerland provide greater assistance in criminal investigations and that Swiss banks be required to reject obviously criminal transactions. The Swiss resistance to these American pressures was firm and based on several arguments. Switzerland maintained that banking secrecy was fundamental to Swiss sovereignty and to the Swiss financial services industry's competitiveness. They argued that Switzerland had no obligation to enforce other countries' laws, and they noted that American criticism was hypocritical given American banks' own roles in questionable transactions and American governmental use of Swiss banks for intelligence operations. The bilateral negotiations between Switzerland and the United States produced limited agreements that allowed some cooperation in criminal investigations while maintaining core banking secrecy protections. Switzerland agreed to provide assistance in cases involving activities that were criminal under both Swiss and American law, but they refused to provide assistance in cases involving violations of American laws that weren't crimes in Switzerland, including many intelligence operations and export control violations. The multilateral efforts through international organizations to establish greater financial transparency made limited progress during the Cold War. The Financial Action Task Force and other bodies established standards for anti-money laundering controls and for international cooperation in financial investigations. But Switzerland was slow to adopt these standards, maintaining that its domestic legal framework was adequate and that international pressure represented inappropriate interference in Swiss sovereignty. The exposure of specific intelligence operations sometimes revealed Swiss banking's role incidentally even when the primary focus was the operation itself rather than the financial infrastructure. When Soviet spy rings were uncovered in Western countries, investigations sometimes revealed Swiss accounts used to pay the spies. When defectors described their recruitment and compensation, Swiss accounts were often part of the story. These incidental exposures accumulated over time, gradually building public awareness of Swiss banks' intelligence role. The academic and policy analysis of Swiss banking's role in intelligence operations was limited during the Cold War because of classification of relevant documents and because of the difficulty of researching topics where primary sources were deliberately hidden. Scholars could analyze the general phenomenon based on publicly available information and on logical inferences about what intelligence services would require from banking infrastructure. But detailed academic work had to wait for post-Cold War declassification and investigation. The end of the Cold War created opportunities for greater exposure as former intelligence officers wrote memoirs, as archives were opened, and as the political sensitivities around intelligence operations decreased. The opening of Stasi archives after German reunification provided extensive documentation of East German intelligence use of Swiss accounts. Soviet archives provided some information about KGB banking relationships, though much remains classified. Western services have been slower to declassify material about Swiss accounts, but memoirs and historical studies have gradually revealed more. The investigations in the 1990s and 2000s into Swiss banking's World War II role, including acceptance of Nazi gold, created precedents for investigating Swiss banks' questionable historical activities. These investigations established that Swiss banks had sometimes facilitated serious wrongdoing and that Swiss neutrality claims had sometimes been facade for profitable complicity in crimes. The methodology and legal frameworks developed for investigating wartime activities could potentially be applied to investigating Cold War intelligence operations. The continuing secrecy around many aspects of Swiss banking and intelligence operations means that full historical accounting remains impossible. Intelligence services maintain classification of operational details decades after events occurred. Swiss banks are protected by banking secrecy laws that prevent disclosure even of historical information, and many participants are deceased or unwilling to speak publicly about their activities. The role of Swiss banks in facilitating Cold War intelligence operations represents a case study in how neutral financial infrastructure enabled systematic activities that violated laws in multiple countries while generating enormous profits for institutions that claimed they were simply providing banking services. Between 1950 and 1991, Swiss banks processed hundreds of billions of dollars in intelligence-related transactions, maintaining accounts for spies, defectors, and information brokers from both Eastern and Western blocs, while collecting fees and maintaining plausible deniability about the purposes being served. The scale and sophistication of this financial infrastructure was remarkable. Major intelligence services from both sides maintained dozens or hundreds of accounts across multiple Swiss banks. Individual transactions ranged from thousands to millions of dollars. The accounts facilitated payments to human sources, funded technical operations, supported defector resettlement, and processed the financial logistics of espionage, spanning continents and ideological divides. The moral dimension remains deeply troubling. Swiss banks knowingly facilitated espionage operations that included recruiting officials to betray their countries, transferring technology that violated export controls, and supporting operations that led to intelligence officers being identified and killed. The bank's claims of neutrality obscured their functional role as essential infrastructure for activities both sides conducted that violated international law and that caused real human suffering. The legal framework protecting Swiss banks from responsibility for client activities was policy choice reflecting Swiss governmental decisions to prioritize banking secrecy and financial services, industry profits over broader considerations of international law and moral obligation. Switzerland benefited economically from serving as the financial infrastructure for Cold War espionage, while maintaining political neutrality that allowed relationships with both blocs. The institutional complicity extended beyond banks to include Swiss governmental authorities who understood that banks were serving intelligence operations but maintained plausible deniability, legal frameworks that prevented accountability. The Swiss government's official position that it didn't monitor or control how clients used Swiss banks was deliberate policy that enabled profitable but questionable activities. The practical importance of Swiss banking infrastructure to intelligence operations was substantial. Both Eastern and Western services depended on Swiss accounts for critical operational capabilities, including paying sources across enemy lines, managing financial logistics for operations in multiple countries, and providing secure financial arrangements that protected sources and operational security. Without Swiss banking infrastructure, many intelligence operations would have been impossible or far more difficult and risky. The question of whether Swiss neutrality was genuine or merely profitable facade is answered partly by examining Swiss banking's role. Switzerland was neutral in the sense of not joining military alliances and not taking sides in diplomatic confrontations. But Swiss financial institutions were actively engaged in facilitating both sides' intelligence operations, profiting from serving clients whose activities were fundamentally opposed. This was neutrality of convenience that prioritized Swiss economic interests. The comparison to Swiss banking's role in World War II reveals concerning patterns. During both conflicts, Swiss banks provided financial services to all parties while claiming neutrality. During World War II, this included accepting Nazi gold and processing financial transactions for the Nazi regime. During the Cold War, it included facilitating espionage and illegal technology transfer. In both cases, commercial profits and legal technicalities were prioritized over moral considerations. The legacy of Cold War Swiss banking continues affecting contemporary discussions about financial regulation, banking secrecy, and institutional responsibility for facilitating wrongdoing. The gradual erosion of Swiss banking secrecy since the Cold War reflects international pressure and changing norms about financial transparency. But Switzerland maintains stronger confidentiality protections than many jurisdictions, continuing to attract clients seeking privacy. The question of whether formal accounting and accountability should occur for Swiss banks' Cold War role remains unresolved. Unlike the investigations into wartime activities that led to settlements and partial restitution, Cold War intelligence operations haven't been subjected to similar scrutiny. Former intelligence officers and bank employees who participated in these operations have generally avoided accountability, protected by classification, statutes of limitations, and political decisions not to pursue historical grievances. Whether the Swiss banking infrastructure that enabled Cold War intelligence operations ultimately contributed to stability by providing channels for intelligence activities, or to instability by facilitating espionage and technology transfer is debatable. The infrastructure allowed both sides to conduct operations that might otherwise have been impossible, potentially reducing some operational risks while enabling operations that created other dangers. The fundamental lesson is that financial institutions claiming neutrality while profiting from facilitating serious wrongdoing cannot escape moral responsibility through legal technicalities about jurisdiction and sovereignty. Swiss banks knew they were processing payments for espionage operations, knew these operations violated laws in the countries where they occurred, and chose to provide services because they were profitable while maintaining claims of neutrality that obscured their complicity.